Hello, welcome to Learning Target 3.3. You've made your way on to the next learning target in the unit Organization and Patterns in Life, so congratulations. Let's get into movement through a membrane, where you'll be able to explain how molecules move through the cell membrane via diffusion and active transport. Let's find out what these things are. Alright, so the first thing we got to do is we're going to be focusing on one type of organelle. I know you just learned all about the organelles in the last learning target or two. Now we're going to be focusing on just one of them. That's the cell membrane. And if you remember from the cell membrane has a few important roles. It's to support the cell, protect the cell, and to let things in and out. And that's what we're focusing on here, how a cell membrane lets things in and out. Now, if you were actually to look at a cell membrane under a microscope, a really high-powered electron microscope, it would look something like this. However, if you were to draw it as an animation, it would look something more like this. And all you really need to know about the cell membrane and how it looks is that it's made of two different layers. One of the layers likes water. Those are those circular things here. And one of the layers does not like water. Those are the tails things, or the legs hanging on here. So that's why they're orientated in that particular way. Anyways, the cell membrane, it looks like this. It lets things in and out. So let's find out what this is all about. The cell membrane is selectively permeable. You need to know what the word selectively permeable means in order to understand the rest of the topic. So let's get into it here. Selectively permeable. A permeable substance means that something is able to pass through it. If it's permeable, like a sponge is permeable, for example, it's permeable to water. Water can pass through a sponge. Selectively permeable, however, is something which means that only certain things can pass through it. So if you think of something like a window screen, people like to put window screens in front of their windows because it lets certain things in, like air and light, but it keeps things like bugs out. Same thing is true of the cell membrane. The cell membrane is selectively permeable because certain things can come in and out, but not all things can come in and out. And you can see why that might be advantageous for a cell. You don't want bad things coming in, although bad things can get through a selectively permeable membrane. But having a selectively permeable membrane where only certain things can pass through, the cell can then regulate what's good and what's bad, or what can actually get through the cell. Now, typically, the smaller things are, easier time they have getting through the cell. So you can see here things like oxygen, carbon dioxide, those are gases. Gases are relatively small. The molecules of gases can easily pass through. Water is made of H2O. Those are small. It's a small molecule to get through. However, larger things like carbohydrates, sometimes these macromolecules here, these are larger things. They have a harder time passing through. So a selectively permeable membrane, only certain things can pass through, and typically that's based on how large something is. The smaller it is, the easier time it has getting through the membrane. The larger it is, the harder it is for it to get through. Now, the first type of movement through a membrane that we're focusing on is called diffusion. And there's a couple of vocab words here that you need to understand to get this concept. First of all, the movement of molecules from a high concentration to a low concentration until equilibrium is reached is the definition of diffusion that you should know. And you should also know that for diffusion, no extra energy is required. However, before we get into how that's working, let's look at the word concentration. Concentration you may think about as like being focused, or I'm really concentrating on something. Well, if you're concentrating your focus, all of your energy and attention is on one thing. It's not quite the same when we're talking about molecules. When we're talking about molecules, we're talking about how close things are together. So if something is highly concentrated, that means there's a lot of it in one area. If there's a low concentration, it means it's more spread out. So you can see that these molecules here are more highly concentrated, or more close together, than these molecules over here, which are in a lower concentration. Okay, got that point? High and low concentration. Now let's move on to diffusion. Now diffusion, here's an example of what you have actually seen diffusion happening before. Let's say you were to take some food coloring and drop it into a beaker of water. And when you first drop that food coloring into the beaker of water, where the dye molecules are, they're highly concentrated. They're really close together. Now, we just learned about the definition of diffusion when things go from a high to a low concentration. Another way to think about that is the things that they just start to spread out. And they do that without any energy being added. There's no extra energy needed, and those things continue to spread out from where there's a lot of them to where there's not so many of them, until there's about a relatively equal amount of them throughout the entire substance. And that's what happens when you add food coloring into a beaker of water. At first, the dye molecules are really close together. There's a high concentration. There's not so many over here. So what happens is they slowly spread apart, and then eventually the entire beaker, all that water has turned red. And when that happens, we reach something called equilibrium. Now, if you look at this word equilibrium, you'll see it kind of looks like equal, it sounds like equal, and it's just a fancy way of saying that there's an equal amount of red dye molecules spread all throughout the lab. So that's diffusion. When things move from a high concentration to a low concentration without energy until there's about an equal amount all throughout that particular substance. So let's check in here, okay? So you see here is the outside of the cell. Let's pretend that this is the inside of the cell. This is the cell membrane with its two layers. Which direction, based on what you know about diffusion, do you think these molecules will diffuse, right? Do you think that molecules are going to go this way? And molecules are going to go this way. This one's pretty easy. It's a warm-up. So what do you think? Yeah, the molecules are going to move this way from a higher concentration to a low concentration. There's nothing even over on this side, so I mean, you probably picked that way. At least I hope, right? Let's try one that's a little more hard. How about this one? Which way do you think the molecules are going to move for diffusion this time? That's right. They're going to go from a higher concentration to a low concentration. So from the inside of the cell, they're going to move out. No energy needed. How about... I thought I had a third one. I must have taken it out. Okay, that's fine. Well, that's diffusion, right? Now, there's a couple types of diffusion that are special. There's special types of diffusion. The first one of those is something called osmosis. Now, osmosis is when water diffuses, or when water goes from a high concentration to a low concentration. Now, let's say that this is a pretend cell membrane that's selectively permeable. And we know that a selectively permeable membrane only allows certain things to pass through it. So let's say that we add some water into this U-shaped tube. This is the initial state in the beginning, right? But the thing that we add into the water, this dissolved salt, is a large molecule. And as a result, that large molecule is unable to pass through the selectively permeable membrane. It's too big. So unfortunately, we can't get to diffusion by the molecules moving themselves. We cannot go from a high to a low concentration because every time this molecule tries to get past the selectively permeable membrane, it gets blocked, right? But, interestingly enough, we can still reach a state of equilibrium or balance where there's an equal concentration or relative concentration of each substance on each side of the selectively permeable membrane by the fusion of water. And what's happening here is, well, there's a higher concentration of molecules here and a lower concentration of molecules here. So in order to kind of dilute this side, to make it equal to this side, the water can actually move from this side to this side. And then what we have happening here is that because there's now more water on this side of the tube, these salt molecules have been diluted a little bit. So they're about equal concentration as this nut. So there's less water here, so this side becomes a little more concentrated. The salt becomes a little more saltier, so to speak. And over here, it becomes a little more salty because there's less water, or there's more water added. It's kind of a confusing concept. I'm doing my best to explain it to you, but essentially, just to go back to it here, it's because the molecules, they can't diffuse from one side to the other, so the water moves. And diffusion is the movement of water. If you're not sure about this slide, call me over and I can help you to explain it a little bit better. Here's another more real-world example of osmosis. So let's say we put some cells in tap water, right? Tap water has something that's relatively equal to the amount of salts and other molecules that's inside of the cell. Now, if you put cells in tap water, they're going to remain fairly normal, right? Same is true here in a plant cell. But what if we added something called distilled water? Now, distilled water is pure 100% water. So there's a higher concentration of water outside of the cell than inside of the cell, and what happens is the water actually diffuses into the cell. Now, if we're talking about our red blood cells, or our animal cells, right, they're actually going to explode because they don't have a cell wall. But if you're talking about a plant cell which does have a cell wall, that distilled water is going to go into the cell, and it's going to actually swell up and allow that plant to stand up straight. Sometimes you've seen a plant that kind of kiltered over, it's wilting a little bit. That's because it's lost a lot of the water. So plants really like actually to have distilled water or a higher concentration of water in the cells around them because it helps them stand up straight. Now what if you placed cells into salt water? You've probably gone to the movies before, had some popcorn, the popcorn's really salty, and then you start to feel thirsty. Well, that's because all the water inside of your cells are leaving to try to balance out that osmotic gradient. And what happens is when you add salt water to cells, the water leaves those cells because it's trying to balance out the amount of salt that's inside and outside of the cells. And as a result, an animal cell shrivels up. And the same thing is true of a plant cell. The water leaves the cell and the cell membrane actually starts to shrink away from the cell wall. So in tap water, things stay about the same. Water is in equilibrium. Distilled water, water goes in. And in salt water, the water leaves the cells and they shrivel up. One last type of diffusion. You don't need to know this for your verbal quiz, but I wanted to show it to you just so you see what it looks like and what it's all about. It's called facilitated diffusion, and this is a type of diffusion that's used for large particles. And in order to get large particles inside of the cell, sometimes they can pass through something called a protein channel. So these large particles typically would not be able to pass through the cell membrane on their own. However, there are some specific places, kind of like maybe a bouncer at the door or going through the toll booth, so to speak. They just this is where they can go through, and they're facilitated through to the other side of the cell. So here are 3 different types of diffusion that don't require any type of energy. We have regular diffusion, where the molecules themselves move from a high to a low concentration. We have osmosis, where the molecules may be too big to pass through the selectively permeable membrane, but the water is small enough to balance out the concentration, so the water actually goes from one place to another. And then we have facilitated diffusion for large particles. Okay? There's one last type of way that you need to know about how molecules move through a cell membrane, and that's called active transport. Now the word active, you can probably think of things moving and being active, sure. And transport, things go from one place to another. Well, active transport is the movement of molecules from a low to a high concentration, the opposite of diffusion, and they require energy, and the type of energy they require is ATP. If you think back to the cell organelles learning target, you'll remember that the mitochondria is responsible for making ATP. So that mitochondria makes the ATP, and that ATP is the energy that allows molecules to move from a low concentration to a high concentration. So we look at this figure over here, and we could just look at the molecules themselves. You can see there's a higher concentration of these red molecules on this side of the cell membrane in comparison to this side of the cell membrane. So if this was diffusion, you would think that things would go from a high concentration to a low concentration. So they go like this, maybe through facilitated diffusion. However, there may be some times when a cell wants, to hang on to these things. It may be energy, it may be food, or maybe some kind of protein that it wants. So it wants to try to get as many of these molecules in as possible. And the way that a cell can do that is by using its energy through the form of ATP to take molecules from a low concentration to a high concentration. Think of it as kind of like pushing a boulder up the hill, right? You can get that boulder to the top of the hill, but it's going to require a lot of energy. Same thing is true to get molecules from a low place to a high place, or a low concentration to a high concentration. You're going to need energy to do that. Okay, so just to check in here for active transport, which direction, if this was active transport, would you expect the molecules to move? Right. In active transport, things go from a low concentration to a high concentration. However, they require ATP energy. So here is all the different types of movement through a membrane that we went through. We went through different types of diffusion, which are referred to as passive transport because they do not require energy. Simple diffusion from a high to a low concentration. Facilitated diffusion through a protein channel. Active transport, when we're getting things going from a low concentration to a high concentration, but we need ATP energy. And osmosis, when the substance inside the water can't pass through the selectively permeable membrane because it's too large, so instead the water itself is used to balance out the concentration of the two sides. That is Learning Target 3.3. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, let me know. Good luck in your activity.